Joe Colombo was a man who liked to do things differently. He was the only mobster who dared to protest against the FBI.
You don't go to war with the United States government. Nobody goes to war with the United States government. They're too powerful.
But Colombo did. His weapon of choice, mass protest.
There's a conspiracy in this country against every Italian American. We've been saying this, we'll continue to say it, and it's only till it touches them.
But in following this path, Colombo moved from crime into politics and the glare of publicity. On the way, he broke the cardinal rule of the Mafia.
He was the one that chose publicity over silence. He was the one that chose cameras over staying in the shadows.
Colombo became infatuated with fame and celebrity and completely forgot the way a mobster should live.
This incensed the old mafioso. They didn't want that. And he was told, stop this. If you continue, you're gonna pay a price.
In the heart of Manhattan, in front of thousands of witnesses, Joe Colombo would face his day of reckoning. Across the East River from Manhattan lies the borough of Brooklyn. In 1962, this was Mafia country. The hunting ground of Joseph Colombo. The 40-year-old mobster lived and worked these streets. He was a capo, or captain, a mid-ranking mafioso in New York's Profaci crime family. One of the 5 crime families that dominated the city's criminal underworld. Then, in 1964, an event took place that would supercharge his career. Colombo was summoned by his Mafia boss to an important meeting. Joe Magliocco had a mission for him. It was a hit, and a particularly dangerous one. For Joseph Colombo, this was nothing new. He had already killed people, about 11 murders to date. Rubbing people out was what capos did.
You would never advance the capo without killing.
If they tell you to kill somebody, you go out and kill somebody. And you don't resign except feet first.
You would not even be considered for capo unless you murdered somebody on orders from the boss.
So until this moment, Colombo was nothing special within Mafia circles. Just one killer amongst many.
There are plenty of people like that around. Typical kind of hoodlum, nothing outstanding about him that I know of.
But that was about to change forever. The target this time was none other than Carlo Gambino. From a young hoodlum, he had become New York's biggest Mafia godfather.
Gambino was generally regarded as the most powerful boss in the city.
He was unquestionably the most fearsome mobster in town. Gambino had built his family into New York's toughest clan.
He could take on 3 out of the 5 families at one time. That's how big his organization was. And he had some of the best killers that there were. If you killed Carlo Gambino, that was the kiss of death.
So, rather than kill Carlo Gambino, Colombo decided to tip him off. He was now breaking one of the mob's most important rules. Every Mafia family relies on unswerving loyalty from its members. This is one of the so-called 10 Commandments. Your family comes first. Always.
You swear allegiance to that family and only that family. Nothing will come before your family, your Mafia. And everything else takes second place to it.
But Colombo completely rejected this. He went straight to the man he'd been told to kill. Carlo Gambino. The move worked well. Gambino was grateful. First, he ordered Colombo's boss, Joe Magliocco, to retire. Then, as a reward for Colombo's bold move, he was given Magliocco's old job. He was promoted to head of a family, renamed in his honor. The Profaci family became the Colombo family in 1964.
Sometimes if you want to advance, you have to make bold moves. Very bold, but it worked out.
Colombo had made Mafia history. He became the youngest Godfather in a generation. Thanks to Colombo's new position, there were now real benefits. He could live off the proceeds of crime paid to him by his criminal family members.
Well, if you're the Godfather, you're the boss of the family, and depending upon the size of that family, all your capos have to be bringing an envelope up to you. Everything that is brought into the family is kicked up to the head of the family.
Colombo eagerly took over the best money-making operations, and the cash rolled in.
Anywhere where there was money to be made, you could find organized crime.
They know how to make money out of just about anything.
There was illegal gambling. Sometimes games were rigged to earn extra cash.
Well, the gambling racket was basically, you could have a floating crap game or a poker game, and it could be moved anywhere within the city of New York. I mean, it had cocktail waitress and everything. It was a high-end roller, and it still goes on today.
Colombo and his men didn't just make money from the bets, but also from loan sharking to gamblers or anyone who needed cash fast. Loan sharking, or Shylock loans, charged borrowers huge rates of weekly interest, known as the VIG.
Basically, there are many people out there that need money, and banks would not that readily give them the money because they had no financial backing. Organized crime would. Of course, he would pay an interest on the money, almost 25 to 26%. If you miss a payment, they'll double the VIG.
If you carried on missing payments, you could expect a beating, or worse. The loan shark book of any Mafia operator could run into hundreds of thousands of dollars of weekly income. It was an easy way to make cash on the street. Colombo also made money from hijacking trucks and cargoes. The stolen goods were then sold on, known as fencing. Added to the mix was extortion, protection rackets, and infamous Mafia-run union scams. Unions controlled everything from construction to garbage. So the Mafia took over the unions. They plundered the pension funds and set up trade monopolies that benefited only them. As a result, Colombo was getting seriously rich. The only problem was, this wealth began to attract the attention of the police and the FBI. couple of years into Colombo's reign, the authorities started to look hard at organized crime in New York. In the previous decade, the police and FBI had been slow to recognize the threat posed by the Mafia. Now Colombo and the city's Mafia families were in their sights. In September 1966, the FBI and Queens District Attorney's Office made its first breakthrough. A massive bust at the La Stella restaurant in the east of the city.
La Stella was a restaurant on Queens Boulevard in Queens, and they brought in the mob chiefs from all over the country, and they all sat down and broke bread and went over their operations, and we were able to get information from an informant that they were all there, and we raided the place.
The Queens District Attorney made a big deal of the raid.
These are 13 of the top mob leaders in the country. Their meeting has nationwide implications in our opinion, and as far as we know, this is a unique meeting. We have never had such a meeting of top family leaders and gangdom leaders in this county to our knowledge.
It heralded the start of a new fight back against the mob, and especially the New York families. Colombo, as a family head, was now on the law enforcement radar. In 1966, he was subpoenaed to stand as a witness in a federal investigation into racketeering. It meant appearing before what's known under the American system as a grand jury.
Well, everybody's afraid of what's going to happen in a federal grand jury because it forces people to come in to appear and give testimony, and now you lock them into that testimony.
Colombo could no longer hide in the shadows. He was dragged into a very public arena. But when he came to court, he stuck to mob protocols and refused to testify, insisting he was just an honest businessman.
One of the codes of the mob is don't make yourself a target. Don't make yourself to go out there and bring attention to you and to our operation, what they call our thing, Cosa Nostra.
The code of silence is held by a lot of different groups. And the old bosses believed in keeping a low profile and your mouth shut.
His strict observance of this tradition cost him. His punishment was 30 days in jail, an easy stretch. But for Joe Colombo, this was an epiphany. He realized what attracted the FBI and police to him was his wealth without any visible source of income. So he devised a perfect solution to deal with the new heat from the FBI. He would become an ordinary working Joe, and he passed down a diktat that all his family members had to hold down a real job too, a facade of legality. Colombo led by example. He worked as a salesman at Cantalupo Realty, based here at 86th Street in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. On their books, the Godfather was a $35,000 a year employee. In reality, he conducted his Mafia business at the offices. Now, when pressed by the authorities, he could explain his lifestyle. And what a lifestyle it was. The money flooded in from his numerous rackets. And Colombo was starting to get carried away with his status. He headed across town to party and enjoy the good life in Manhattan. He became increasingly flamboyant and extravagant. Bedecked in expensive jewelry and suits, Colombo cruised around the city in flashy Cadillacs.
Joey liked to dress like the biggest actors. He liked to dress as good as Frank Sinatra. He liked to dress as good as Dean Martin. He didn't want to look like the schlep. He just didn't buy a suit off the rack. The suits were tailor-made, silk shirts. He had everything made. Everything was tailored. He was meticulous about his clothes.
By now, other mobsters had learned this was not a good idea. Flashing the cash drew the attention of the authorities.
Carlo Gambino, you'd never see him in a nightclub or a bar or checking out with women. He was just low-key.
And the other Mafia clans were right to worry. Colombo had reignited attention from the FBI and the income tax authorities, who started to look even more closely at his finances. $35,000 a year and tailor-made suits and shirts did not add up. So the FBI decided to go after Colombo. In 1970, his son, Joe Jr., was arrested for melting down silver coins to extract precious metals. Colombo viewed this as a trumped-up charge designed to get at him. It was the final straw. Now, he hit upon a radical solution to the FBI sniffing around his affairs: civil rights. After all, this was a rich time for civil rights activism. Across America, street protest was flourishing. The African-American civil rights movement was changing the face of America and inspired many other minority groups into action.
We're going to walk together. We're going to stand together. We're going to sing together. We're going to stay together. We're going to moan together. We're going to groan together. And after a while, we'll say, freedom, freedom, freedom now!
So Colombo got on the bandwagon. From a campaign office here at 7th Avenue, the former hitman prepared to step fully out of the shadows and into the glare of publicity and politics.
We feel that the people have had it, and the Italian people in particular, in the United States, which number 38 million, have been losing its identity as time has been going on, more and more and more so.
He exploited the growing unrest in the Italian-American community of the time.
He claimed that Italians were being discriminated against. There was some truth in that. At that particular time, you found very few Italian names on Wall Street in law or banking firms. And a lot of Italian Americans were not involved in any kind of organized crime or any other kind of crime.
So, Colombo would stand up for the rights of ordinary Italian Americans. And he started in a way that nobody could have foreseen.
In effect, he declared war on the FBI. So he began picketing FBI headquarters, which was then on the Upper East Side.
It was a remarkable opening salvo, picketing the very heart of law enforcement in New York.
He thought, if I claim that they're discriminating against me, I can either make them back off or slow them down.
Day after day, a crowd of demonstrators harassed FBI agents coming and going and accused them of unduly targeting men like himself, who were legitimate businessmen.
Why the FBI? Why is the FBI, in your mind, persecuting the Italians?
He used all his underlings, and we used to call them mooks, M-O-O-K-S, to stand out there and do the picketing for him.
Well, it's obvious by just what everybody could read in the paper. Every time you see something, you see that the FBI is labeling Italian people belonging to an organization which they refer to as the Mafia. As far as we're concerned as Italian people, there is no such thing. It's a word that's been invented by the law enforcement agencies, and we don't feel it's right.
The crowds grew, and media attention followed. Colombo reveled in it.
There's a conspiracy in this country against every Italian American. We've been saying this, we'll continue to say it, and it's only till it touches them. And who are they? Are they any better than you, I, or anybody else standing in this crowd? Litigation on them.
This unspoken challenging of authority was unheard of in Mafia circles. It was in marked contrast to his silence at the grand jury years before. Mafia men, used to speaking in hushed tones of the Cosa Nostra, were unsettled.
I've worked all my life, and if it isn't in a real...
Why declare war on law enforcement? You're going to have enough trouble with them as it is. Why make it personal?
The worry growing in the highest circles of the Mafia was law enforcement scrutiny would intensify because of Colombo's actions. But initially, for the FBI agents, it was a new, unsettling tactic. The tables had been turned.
I know a lot of them were very furious with him. There were some collisions there on the picket lines where they almost came to blows.
Now I'll go a little further. Many of the other minority groups are starting to feel this thing. And when they get through with us, they have to go on to the next body of people. And this is where the public should wake up, and this is where the public should start demanding some of these things be brought out to light. And why are they so frightened of an investigation? And why shouldn't there be an investigation on them?
In 1970, Colombo shifted his protest movement up a gear. He created the Italian-American Civil Rights League.
Everybody wanted to be attached to it. Everybody, including the politicians, radio commentators, actors, singers, everybody. And then people started to realize, hey, the Italians contributed a lot, and a lot they should be proud of.
The League, with Colombo at the helm, had huge success almost instantly, recruiting some 50,000 paid-up members to its cause.
Now you see nationality flags. Well, Joe Colombo started it. It was the Italian flag being placed on every Cadillac that was in Brooklyn, owned by an Italian, or a Lincoln owned by an Italian. Every car had an Italian flag on it. Everybody bought into it.
And Colombo's League achieved some notable early victories. They took their campaign to the highest echelons of corporate America. Major brands like General Motors and Alka-Seltzer were targeted. Their ad campaigns were considered demeaning to Italian Americans. The League got them withdrawn. They also got a board game based on the Mafia pulled from Macy's department store. Even Hollywood felt the wrath of the League. Producers of the Godfather movie started to have trouble filming in New York. Production was threatened by walkouts, obstructions, and delays. The League came to the rescue, offering to smooth the process if the producers agreed to remove all references to the Mafia or Cosa Nostra from the script. League captains then toured Italian-American neighborhoods to sell the idea of the film to skeptical residents. Finally, filming was allowed to continue uninterrupted on the landmark Godfather film. Colombo went further still. He even got the New York mayor, prosecutors, and FBI to stop referring to the term Mafia in its official documentation, as it was prejudicial. The city was listening to Joe Colombo, and the League was proving to be highly effective. In In 1970, Colombo was ready for the League's showpiece. Its first Italian-American Unity Day rally, to be held in Columbus Circle in the heart of Manhattan. Under the glare of news cameras, 50,000 people attended. The city's traditionally bustling Little Italies were deserted. The other mob families reluctantly allowed Italian-American businesses to close for the day in solidarity.
There was so much press, and the streets were just mobbed with people that were so proud of being Italian, and everybody wanted to get up on the dais to be standing next to Joe Colombo when he spoke of national pride and fellowship.
My fellow Americans,
Colombo held the stage and attacked the law enforcement community.
say to the American government that I'm very
It was a triumph for the Godfather turned activist. In the wake of the rally, interview followed interview. He appeared on TV chat shows and in magazine articles.
I mean, he gave press conferences to all the major newspapers, the Daily News, the New York Mirror, the Post. I mean, every newspaper wanted to hear from him.
Publicly, he continued to describe the Mafia as a myth and promised to champion the rights of all minorities.
Is the Italian-American Civil Rights League accomplishing the aims that were set for it? Oh, definitely. What has it done? How has it helped? It has helped, not me personally, but helped all people. It has helped people of all ethnic groups. It's helped children. It's helped elderly people. It's helped anyone that needs help. It's made people feel that there are no orphans, and anybody who would want help would only have to ask for it, and they would have it.
Up until now, Colombo's League had preserved an air of legality. However, under Colombo, this positive gloss was wearing thin. Because he was still a mobster, and the League was just another money-making opportunity.
American Civil Rights League was created by Joe Colombo to fight against discrimination. As far as that went, it wasn't a bad idea, but he was the wrong person to be doing something like that. He was the wrong person to be represented as a leader of the Italian-American community.
In fact, Colombo was hijacking a legitimate cause. The League proved to be a money spinner. It was netting him plenty of funds that he could appropriate.
Joe Colombo formed the Italian-American Civil Rights as a racket, as a scam to make money, period. And he used it for that purpose. He was shaking down store owners all over Italian neighborhoods, forcing them to put his sticker in a window. It was an Italian flag with a 1 on it, Italian-American Civil Rights League, and he actually was garnering receipts from that.
A very wise state senator here, who was an Italian-American, said, Colombo, don't be fooled by Colombo.
Colombo wasn't just breaking the law by skimming off a legitimate cause. He was creating jealousy and suspicion in the Mafia ranks and within his own family. His old mentor, Carlo Gambino, started to warn him.
And he was told by Carlo, stop this. We don't want it. And no ands, ifs, or buts was taken. If you continue, you're going to pay a price.
But Colombo was oblivious to any looming danger. He thought he was untouchable, on the crest of a wave, and a media darling. He wouldn't back down. 1971 was going to be his year.
Colombo was an egotist. He figured he was bigger and better than the unit that he was working with, which was the Mafia.
Then, there was more trouble. The FBI struck again. Angered by Colombo's actions through the Italian-American Civil Rights League, they issued subpoenas for various high-profile bosses. In December 1970, he was arrested, along with one of his men, Rocco Miraglia. When police searched their car, they found a briefcase stuffed full of incriminating documents detailing the various Colombo family rackets. But worse still, the names of other high-ranking mob men. Colombo was immediately called before a federal grand jury to explain himself. But then he did something utterly unforgivable. Rather than keeping his mouth shut, like he had the last time he came before a grand jury, he adopted a different tactic and decided to talk his way out of it. He explained that the dollar amounts next to names were simply donations for his league. Carl, he explained, was none other than Carlo Gambino, reputed Mafia boss. The $30,000 next to his name was actually a donation to the league. That was a bad move. You don't implicate the boss of bosses before a grand jury, especially when you're telling a lie. The repercussions were immediate. That same year, the police department moved in on the Mafia and federal strike forces combed the city. Even Carlo Gambino paid the price. He was arrested in 1970. It was clear that it was Colombo's loose mouth that had got him into deep trouble with his former protector and with the FBI.
His behavior began to worry bosses like Carlo Gambino.
This incensed the old mafioso. They didn't want that. They wanted silence. They wanted to stay in the shadows. And Joe was bringing them out.
Joe Colombo's days were now numbered. But despite the looming threat, Colombo planned to fight on with his tried and tested formula. He would roll out the league across America. He even booked Frank Sinatra for a fundraiser at Madison Square Gardens. Politicians joined the cause, including State Governor Nelson Rockefeller. And he planned another showcase rally as a platform for his ever-expanding league. This rally would seal his status as a civil rights activist and keep the forces of law and order off his back. But by now, his enemies inside the mob were stirring. An old adversary from his early days as family boss was waiting in the wings. Crazy Joe Gallo was watching events from prison with a critical eye.
Joey Gallo was called Crazy Joe. And there was a reason for that, because he did crazy things.
I'll give you an example of Joe Gallo's operation. They had a club on President Street in Brooklyn. And in the basement, they had a mountain lion that they used to intimidate victims, meaning gambling victims who owed them money or loan sharking victims. And if somebody didn't pay up, they'd just bring him to the club on President Street, open the door to the basement, and down at the bottom of the stairs would be this mountain lion, ready to, and they would do what they were told.
Colombo and Joe Gallo had formed. He and his brothers, Larry and Albert, known as the Gallo clan, had once tried to take over the Colombo family. In the 1960s, they led a bloody insurrection from their base here at President Street in Brooklyn, until Joe Colombo brokered a peace deal with Larry and Albert Gallo, while Crazy Joe was in jail. Now, Crazy Joe was itching to get back at old rival Colombo.
The bottom line is jealousy. Gallo wanted to be the boss of the family, Colombo was the boss of the family, and Gallo wanted to take him out. Simple as that.
Gallo needed soldiers for the forthcoming showdown. And he had a novel idea where to find them. Behind bars, he had made contacts and alliances with African-American gangsters from East Harlem. This was something no one in the Mafia had ever attempted. The two groups were traditionally enemies. But Gallo was ahead of his time. He saw that if the two groups worked together, they could be stronger. Then, in February 1971, Colombo's old enemy, Crazy Joe Gallo, was released after 9 years in prison. Publicly, he swore his Mafia days were over, and he renounced his criminal past. But privately, it was business as usual. He was back on the streets. In his eyes, the peace deal was null and void. As far as he was concerned, the war was never over, and he was preparing for a counterattack. So it was that the stage was set for the second Italian-American Unity Day rally, held in June 1971, at the same site as his triumph a year earlier, New York's Columbus Circle.
They had a huge rally which attracted thousands and thousands of Italian Americans. This was Colombo's rally to rally the Italian people against the FBI and the New York City Police Department and law enforcement in general. Now, we were a distance away taking pictures and doing intelligence work, taking plate numbers and observing who was there.
However, something had changed. The Mafia bosses had instructed Italian Americans to stay at work. The League was no longer tolerated. 40,000 fewer people turned out.
Attendance was down then at the next Columbus Day rally. They passed the word that stores should not close and people should not attend.
Just before noon, Colombo headed to the podium to speak. He was preparing to launch another stinging attack on the FBI. An African-American news cameraman with press credentials approached. As the journalists grabbed Colombo's attention for a soundbite, the newsman moved forward.
Well, I was there the day that happened, and lo and behold, up comes this gunman and shoots Colombo in the head. Down he goes.
Then something even more remarkable happened.
And the man that shot him was dead before he hit the floor. So there was actually 2 killings arranged that day. One to have Joe shot, and one to have the shooter killed.
Joe Colombo was immediately rushed to hospital, alive but comatose. Confusion reigned, and supporters were at a loss to explain what had happened.
You know, he was down on the ground and there was blood on his right cheek. And, it's incredible. You don't expect to see these things in the course of covering a story. And the shots kept coming, and I was standing 3 feet or less, and then I started to run. And I heard somebody else's shot, but I wasn't there. I ran.
As far as I know, Joe is in Roosevelt Hospital in critical condition with 2 shot wounds, one in the chest and one in the head. And I understand one of the perpetrators is dead. You know who did it? I have no idea. I have no idea who did it. Did you see it? No, I did not see it. I was standing behind the stand when it happened.
What's your reaction to this? Our reaction is, right now, is still a state of confusion as to what really transpired. I'm still trying to piece the information together myself.
The hit on Colombo had been carried out by Jerome Johnson, an African-American from Harlem, but he was a very unlikely killer. He was a drifter and petty criminal with a penchant for stalking girls on a nearby university campus. He had no record as a hitman for the mob. It was a curious discrepancy for New York's chief of detectives, Albert Seidman.
Unfortunately, we have not been able to rule out one possibility or the other. Mr. Johnson is still some sort of a mystery man to us.
What puzzled the police was someone must have told Johnson to undertake the hit and trained him. The question was, who? The African-American link to Harlem pointed to Crazy Joe Gallo.
More and more around town, you hear the gangland theory being pushed, that Gallo didn't make a hit on Colombo.
This is merely conjecture and rumor, but there is no basis to any of it, as far as we have been able to learn thus far.
The simple truth was that other senior Mafia figures must have been at work. Because for over 50 years, no one could be killed without the approval of the Mafia's governing body, the Commission. Every family had a seat on the Commission.
If they had to kill somebody, they had to go to the Commission, and the Commission had to vote on it. This would prevent wide-scale killing and trying to take over different families.
Under its rules, no family head can be rubbed out without the agreement of the other Commission members. The idea was the head of each family had an equal say on how decisions were taken. It was democracy, Mafia style.
First place, you're supposed to have permission of all the other bosses to kill a boss. That's just simple. But bosses can't allow bosses to be killed without the permission of the other bosses. Otherwise, none of them are safe.
Many therefore concluded that Gambino had to be somewhere behind the hit and had sold it to the Commission.
I don't think there was much crying in the Gambino camp or the Gallo camp when Joe Colombo was so seriously wounded.
But as so often with the Mafia, the Columbus Circle shootings and attempt on Colombo's life went unsolved. There was nothing to pin on Gambino.
We're saying that Johnson had some connections with the Carlo Gambino family, but we are not making a statement that that was his exclusive connection with organized crime.
The one man who might know the truth was Crazy Joe Gallo. 11 months later, Crazy Joe was eating with his friends at a seafood restaurant to celebrate his 47th birthday.
They were sitting at a rear table, this group of 6 people, when a man walked in from the back door, and he walked up to the side of the table, and he fired 3 shots. He hit Joe twice, and he hit his bodyguard, Pete the Greek, 1 time.
For the FBI and police investigators, the only explanation had to be Colombo family members out for revenge.
He was killed by elements of the Colombo family. It was ordered by a guy named Joseph Iacovelli, Joe Yack. He was the consiglio, he was the capo in the Colombo family who ordered the hit.
But if Colombo's shooting was supposed to bring stability back to the Mafia, it actually signaled the slow demise of the Colombo crime family. Because, leaderless and at war, the family's fortunes turned irrevocably downwards. It began to tear itself apart in the decades that followed. The internal power struggles never ended. The Colombo family is now just a shadow of its former self. In 2011, a further 125 of its members were arrested. The family's power has collapsed, for now. As for Joe Colombo, none of this mattered. He never recovered from that day at the rally. He remained in a vegetative state and died 8 years after being shot.
Funeral services were held today for one of America's leading crime figures, Joe Colombo.
If you look at his record, he was only arrested for shooting crap when he was 18 years old. Every other indictment, every other accusation came after he became a civil rights leader. And that was another indication on how the media, particularly, champion what law enforcement often gives them. Joe Colombo has left his mark in American society.
He died a maverick godfather, a former killer who had dared to do things differently. But by taking on Mafia rules and fighting the FBI at the same time, it was a battle he could never win.
His picketing the FBI building and police headquarters was kind of stupid. You know, you're not exactly dealing with the faculty at Harvard.
Perhaps his biggest mistake was to find the world of civil activism more intoxicating than running a crime family.
For a while, he got away with it. People who should have known better joined his committees. He was using civil rights as a shield. In my opinion, he was the fool.
Fame would offer Joe Colombo no protection from a failure to obey the most fundamental Mafia principles.
All Joe Colombo's troubles were brought on by himself. I mean, if he had followed the rules of the mob, particularly the mob bosses, and stay out of the limelight and just operate your business and bring money in, he never would have had a problem. But because he became flamboyant and he got his ego swelled, he decided to go out into the public world, which was a major error.
In any case, the high-profile Civil Rights League he founded virtually disappeared overnight. Carmine Galante was a mobster who frightened even the other Mafia men.
He was feared by everybody.
Even if he seemed old, he was deadly.
They were afraid of him. Don't mess with him.
Go to a hardware store and buy a can of nails. Look in the can, that's his face.
He had worked the mean streets for decades.
Carmine Galante was especially cunning. Not simply a predator himself, but a leader of predators.
At the age of 60, his career seemed finished. But from his prison cell, he masterminded an astonishing comeback and flooded New York's streets with heroin.
He was a big narcotics dealer, huge.
His drugs empire would become massive, but it would also make him a target. And his career would end in one of the most famous mob hits of them all.
Carmine was stepping up into a position they didn't want him in.
He wanted that control, and that was his downfall.
Knickerbocker Avenue, Brooklyn, New York. This is the site of one of the most notorious mob crimes ever. Number 205 was once Joe and Mary's restaurant. At the rear was a sheltered terrace. It was here, in the afternoon heat on July the 12th, 1979, that one of the city's biggest mobsters, Carmine Galante, was having lunch. And it was here that he was interrupted. Police officers responded to reports of gunshots and screams inside the restaurant.
The two gentlemen inside died as a result of multiple gunshot and shotgun wounds, and this will be examined further by autopsy.
Galante was victim of one of the most spectacular mob hits for years. It was a fitting end for the man who, more than any other, had been responsible for flooding the United States with heroin. Carmine Galante's career was built on heroin. In fact, he had been knee-deep in it since the 1950s.
That was his trade. He was a narcotics dealer from day one.
In 1957, 4,500 miles from Brooklyn in Palermo, Sicily, a key gathering was held. It took place at the Grand Hotel de Palm to welcome a special guest from America. That man was Joe Bonanno, boss of one of the 5 New York crime families.
When he went to Sicily, he was honored. It was like, you know, the king has returned, and they showed the greatest respect.
Bonanno had brought with him his trusted underboss, Carmine Galante.
He was a known assassin, so he carried a lot of weight in a business where weight counted an awful lot.
Short, stocky man, but very rough, tough, powerful.
Galante and Bonanno were here to discuss with the Sicilian Mafia a means of trafficking heroin into the United States. Galante would be Bonanno's heroin emissary. He would run all the drug side of the business for Bonanno's family. It is one of the myths of the stateside mafia that they didn't get involved in drugs. On the surface, US mafiosi portrayed themselves as men of traditional values, and drugs were not seen as an honorable sideline.
They held themselves out as men of honor, men of loyalty, obedient to old traditions, the way American society no longer was.
But the reality was very different.
Even though they were taboo in the early and mid-50s, all 5 families were involved in heroin trafficking.
From the moment that narcotics were illegal, it fell within their realm.
And Galante's aim was to be at the heart of the action.
Galante wanted to be the pipeline to the United States.
But drug trafficking was a high-risk activity. While the authorities might turn a blind eye to gambling or loan sharking, narcotics had always carried a hefty federal prison sentence. The rewards, however, outweighed the risks, especially if Galante could import the heroin wholesale from Sicily. The island was at the crossroads of the international heroin trade.
The majority of the heroin that was coming in was going through Sicily and smuggled into the United States.
The opium poppies were grown in Turkey. The opium was then refined into a so-called morphine base, usually in Lebanon. Next, it was transformed chemically into pure heroin in the French port of Marseille before being shipped on. This complex international journey from Turkey to North America through France became known as the French Connection. But it was once it was in the US that heroin became hugely profitable. 10 kilos of raw opium could be bought for $350. Once refined into 1 kilo of pure heroin, it was worth 1,000 times that. The pure imported heroin was sold on across the United States for vast profits.
The largest amount of money that could be made since Prohibition was narcotic trafficking. The millions and billions of dollars.
Galante and Bonanno had their eyes on these vast profits made by getting the drugs into the USA. It was to set up this complex smuggling network that the meeting with the Sicilian Mafia had been convened. As a result, Galante and Bonanno sewed up a large part of the supply of heroin for themselves. Their deal became known as the Palermo Summit. And from this point on, Galante began to dominate the heroin trade in the USA. Galante immediately set about overseeing his new business operation. He traveled to Miami, Cuba, Marseille, and above all, Canada. Galante knew Canada especially well. Much of his time in the 1950s was spent in Montreal, where he had risen to become one of the city's biggest mobsters by 1955.
Joe Bonanno sent him to Montreal to organize the rackets there on behalf of the Bonanno family. And one of those rackets is narcotic importation.
He built a network of contacts and a strong power base in Montreal. And it just so happened, Canada was one of the places where French Connection heroin made landfall in North America.
Drugs from Europe and the Middle East would basically go to Montreal or to Toronto. From Montreal, it was only a relatively short drive to New York City.
Galante made sure the drug was hidden in shipping consignments and then smuggled into the USA overland.
They were bringing it in, of course, in cars and in trucks and things like that. A lot of the major cases were in vehicles. You'd take a 20-gallon gas tank and you'd put in a tank that's only about a gallon just to get the car started and off the pier. And the rest of it was filled with heroin in that gas tank. The heroin was in the doors and things like that.
By the late 1950s, Galante was good at his job. He was importing large quantities of heroin.
The Galante organization out of Montreal brought in an estimated 600 kilograms of heroin a year.
Within a short space of time, Galante had built a hugely profitable international heroin smuggling network. But Galante didn't just operate out of Canada because it was good for business. It was also a good place to hide. In the United States itself, Galante was known to the FBI. In fact, the FBI had been tracking him for years. He was on their books as one of the top hoodlums in the country, with an impressive rap sheet. 1930, incarcerated Sing Sing prison, shooting at police detective. Prison assessment, emotionally dull, IQ of a 14-year-old. 1943, implicated as suspected killer of a dissident Italian journalist.
Back in the 1940s, when he was younger, he was suspected of killing a man named Carlo Tresca. That was a very sensational case. A lot of prominent people, very high-ranking Americans, were interested in that case.
He was never indicted due to a lack of witnesses. Although they couldn't pin anything on him, the FBI file on Galante showed they knew he was someone to watch out for. He should be considered armed and extremely dangerous. The file revealed the FBI knew where he had lived, including his Park Avenue address with views of the Chrysler Building. Even his business interests. For Galante, this law enforcement heat was enough to make him nervous, and was a good reason to remain on the run. But all of his narcotics trafficking had drawn the attention of yet another law enforcement agency, one that was even more fearsome than the FBI. It was called the FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The FBN specifically targeted opium and heroin smuggling around the globe. The FBN and the FBI were supposed to get along, but there was a bitter rivalry between them.
The Federal Bureau of Investigations was a much bigger organization than the Bureau of Narcotics. It had 10 times as many agents. It had a budget that was at least 10 times as great, if not greater, than the Bureau of Narcotics.
The rivalry wasn't just professional, it was personal. The two leaders, J. Edgar Hoover for the FBI, Harry Anslinger for the FBN, despised each other. But at this stage, the FBN was way more effective than its federal rivals when it came to targeting the mob.
Of all the law enforcement agencies in the United States, it was the only one that seemed to know everything the Mafia was doing the minute it did it. And it was based largely on the fact that it had been compiling data on each and every mafioso, including Carmine Galante, since 1930.
And the FBN also had a better conviction rate. The reason? It had a powerful weapon at its disposal, the draconian 1956 Narcotics Control Act.
The Narcotics Control Act of 1956 mandated that anybody dealing in heroin could get mandatory sentences up to 40 years.
This was unlike any other country in the world. In Italy or France, people who were arrested with the, for the same quantities of narcotics might serve 2 or 3 years in prison.
From 1959 onwards, the FBN began to target Galante actively. And soon, they had a breakthrough. They discovered where he was. Intelligence revealed that he had traveled from Canada back to New York on business and was in hiding. The FBN arrested him in 1961 on a charge of narcotics trafficking. Galante's case came to court in April 1962. He was about to feel the full force of the Narcotics Control Act. He got 20 years in prison. First at Alcatraz, and then at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Galante had been riding high. Now, he seemed to be washed up.
For Galante to get so many years in prison, I mean, it was a blow to him.
Thanks to the FBN, Galante's career seemed over. Few mobsters could rise again from such a stretch. But then, Galante wasn't just any mobster. Instead of despairing, prison focused Carmine Galante's mind. He started thinking about how to stage a comeback. Jail time hardened Galante's ambition to earn money and one day lead his family. The cornerstone of his stratagem would still be heroin. Even though he was in jail, Galante made sure he kept all his old heroin contacts and supply lines.
He did manage to stay involved in it even from prison.
He certainly had influence over the Bonanno family from prison.
He already had established the contacts in Sicily. They were still there. The Canadian contacts were there.
Then, he started to nurture an idea. To take over the running of his own family, he would need massive amounts of money. Being just one of many heroin importers wouldn't be enough. He needed to become the sole wholesale supplier of heroin into the USA.
He wanted control of that spigot where he could turn it on and off and control the price.
The colossal profits from controlling the heroin trade in America would bankroll his quest for power.
So it was just a matter of when he got out, he was going to make sure that he controlled it all.
Then, as Galante languished behind bars, out on the city's streets, events conspired to help his plan.
While he was in prison, there was a rebellion within the Bonanno family, and it was largely over narcotics.
The old leader he respected, Joe Bonanno, was forced to retire. Many of the capos, or captains that served under him, were killed or retired as well. And the Bonannos also went to war with the other Mafia families. Leaderless and in chaos, a power vacuum opened up. Eventually, in 1974, Philip Rastelli was appointed as the head of Galante's crime family. But he was under police investigation and about to be sent to prison. So, the Bonannos were ripe for takeover, and Galante began to concoct even bolder plans. He wouldn't just take over his own family. He wanted to take on the biggest family in New York, the Gambinos. Run by Carlo Gambino, it had become the city's toughest clan with the most profitable rackets and the deadliest killers. Galante's ambition was to crush the Gambinos and maybe one day become the head of all the Mafia, the so-called boss of bosses. His warders, meanwhile, categorized him as having a psychopathic personality disorder. But whatever his personality failings, outside the prison walls, circumstances continued to help him realize his master plan. Heroin, his main money spinner, was becoming ever more popular.
Heroin use was on the uprise because there was so much of it, and the price was right.
In the ghettos of New York, heroin was now the drug of choice. But local law enforcement couldn't understand how the supply was growing by so much, as former detective Bill Clark explains.
We really weren't hip to just the whole drug trafficking thing, where it was coming from. We didn't realize the hand that the Mafia played in it. As time went on, we realized how far behind it they were, including Carmine Galante. Anytime there's a big pool of money around, somebody's going to try to get into it.
The millions of dollars that were being made, it was astronomical.
The number of registered addicts had boomed from 50,000 at the time of Galante's arrest to 500,000. Politicians attempted to stem the tide, but they failed.
It destroyed a lot of lives. When I first became a policeman, heroin was the drug of choice. Very few working class neighborhoods that weren't losing their sons or daughters to the heroin trafficking and to heroin use.
Well, the addicts, of course, are the end products of it, and you take an addict who had an average habit of $100 or $200 a day, think of all the stuff he has to rob and all the muggings and robberies, and that had a severe effect on what was going on in the United States.
But to exploit the growing demand and to realize his plan, now Galante had to get free. This seemed fanciful until, right in the middle of the heroin craze, his wish was granted. The man with the borderline personality disorder was paroled in 1974 for good behavior, on condition he didn't consort with known felons. After 12 years of careful plotting, the timing could not have been better. He was ready to set his plan into motion. Galante got stuck in immediately with a hectic schedule. First, he got his own house in order.
Galante didn't miss a beat.
When he came out of jail, he started right away.
He moved to fill the leadership vacuum at the top of the Bonanno family. With Philip Rastelli starting a long jail term, Galante assumed the role of acting boss. Then, he laid down a marker. He settled any scores with rivals who had moved in on his business interests while he was in prison.
He was homicidal, quite frankly. He had killed a number of people. He was feared.
The other people around him were absolutely petrified of him.
That made him acceptable as a leader of predators. Not simply a predator himself, but a leader of predators.
Next, he returned to his jet-setting ways.
He wasted no time in solidifying the idea that he would be the main importer of the heroin through these various means that he set up.
He went to Miami, Dallas, Los Angeles, even Disneyland, all the time doing deals with his old associates. And Galante once again hoovered up more heroin supplies at source from the Sicilians.
He had that pipeline open, and there was such an upsurge of heroin coming into the United States.
The pipeline worked so well because Galante had a novel way to bring the heroin in.
When Galante got out, they established a means of bringing in major amounts of heroin.
Airliners arriving in New York throughout the 1970s often had a secret cargo in their hold.
They were bringing heroin in on Alitalia flights. Every flight that left Milan, Italy, every day, a suitcase or two was put on the flight and unaccompanied.
The suitcases were stuffed with pure heroin.
When it landed at JFK, of course, the suitcases were marked.
A Mafia baggage handler would remove the marked suitcase before it even went through customs and pass it on into the network. It worked beautifully.
You're talking about possibly 40 kilos of heroin coming in every day.
Bringing in the drugs was one thing, but Galante needed a distribution network. So he hit upon the idea of using pizza parlors as outlets. It just so happened, this gave him a chance to strike back at his rivals the Gambino family. The Gambino crime family had dominated the cheese and pizza industries for years. They made money by monopolizing the cost of food supplies to the pizza parlors and chasing away competition. Then, a spate of fires at pizza parlors signaled a new front in Galante's heroin campaign. As the Gambino's restaurants burned, new pizza parlors owned by Galante were opened up in their place. And Galante used them to distribute vast amounts of heroin to the dealers.
It would just be distributed. A kilo came in, his people would distribute that pure kilo.
They would sell it to the black drug dealers who were taking all the heat for this.
In short time, Galante once again built a vast international drugs network. He dominated importation and distribution. Drug agent Frank Panessa witnessed this firsthand.
The money that they were making, and not only through the Northeast, he had distribution throughout the United States. I dealt with people in Puerto Rico that were getting their heroin from Galante's people.
He had achieved all this in just 4 years since coming out of jail. It was a ruthlessly fast rise to power, built on fear.
One time, an FBI agent who had infiltrated the family looked in and he said, "He doesn't look like much." He's an old, short guy. And the other gangsters said, "Look out, he's mean." They were afraid of him. Don't mess with him.
At this stage, Galante was only dealing in pure heroin, and he had a particularly unpleasant way of testing its purity. He became infamous at this time for what he called the black man test. An addict would be abducted from Harlem and drugged with 2 bags of heroin. If he died in a set time frame, the drug was pure. But as time went on, Galante began to want even more.
Galante was his own worst enemy. He was making those millions of dollars, but yet he had the greed, and he was greedy. So he would put a whack on it. He would add quinine to it, so something that was 90% heroin, he would whack it so it was 70% heroin and make even more money selling it as pure heroin.
Driven by such greed, his business went from strength to strength. Everything was going well. He was making vast amounts of money and was succeeding in his ambition to become a boss in all but name. The only thing that might spoil his meteoric climb to power was either the law or jealousy from other mobsters who resented his growing dominance. In 1978, it was the law that came knocking first. Galante was arrested and charged with violating the terms of his parole and consorting with known felons. He had been spotted with other criminals, most notably at a Disneyland meeting 3 years earlier. It looked like he would be back behind bars, just as everything was going so well. But once again, he got away with it. Enter Galante's attorney, Roy Cohn. Cohn was a controversial figure who had started his career on many high-profile Senate committees, like the McCarthy hearings. But nowadays, he represented a number of infamous Mafia clients. Cohn had been charged with jewelry tampering and perjury and was now seen as too cozy with the mob. Nevertheless, he was an undisputed star when it came to getting Mafia men off the hook. Cohn was Galante's less than secret weapon to ensure he didn't do yet more time. And it worked for him. In 1978, Cohn succeeded in getting the parole violation charge overturned. And Galante became yet another success story for the mob-friendly lawyer. With law enforcement out of the way, Galante could now turn his attention to an even more pressing threat: his jealous fellow mobsters. Galante was not stupid. He knew they wanted a piece of his drugs profits. But he thought he had the perfect solution: a foolproof way to protect himself. He recruited a band of specialist killers, imported directly from his Sicilian homeland and the same town as his family, Castelmare del Golfo. The derogatory nickname for these men was Zips, and they had well-defined roles.
The Zips were Sicilians brought over by Galante to run the pizza shops that they had all over New York and Pennsylvania, not only to distribute the heroin, but to use these Zips for murders and anything else that they needed from them.
For Galante, the Zips were not soft like American gangsters, but schooled in the old-fashioned ways of doing things, and their loyalty was legendary. The other advantage the Zips had was no criminal record in the States.
And they bring them over here because nobody knows them.
The Zips appealed to Galante on another level, too. They were happy to kill women, children, whoever.
The Zips would kill anybody they were assigned to kill. American hitmen did not like the idea of shooting policemen, prosecutors, or judges. They were off limits to most of the mob. But the Zips would take a contract on anybody.
With rival factions in his own family, most notably supporters of Philip Rastelli and further enemies like the Gambinos, Galante used the Zips to make sure no one messed with him. Two of his most trusted Zips were Cesare Bonaventre, known as the Tall Guy, and his cousin, Baldo Amato.
Well, Cesare was a very imposing figure. He was 6'7". You know, the type that if he had a mirror in front of him, he'd constantly be staring into the mirror. He was a very vain person. Baldo Amato and Cesare Bonaventre were responsible for murders. They were used to collect money because they did a lot of shylocking. They controlled card games in Brooklyn, and if somebody didn't pay up with the money that they lost, they would send out Cesare Bonaventre and Amato.
To ensure their loyalty further, the Zips were rewarded by being made into the crime family. In other words, formally initiated and given their own money-making operations.
All of a sudden to come here and have a beautiful house and have money in the bank and money in cars and stuff, they felt that they're very much indebted to the people that brought them here.
With the Zips guarding his every move, Galante felt untouchable.
Oh, without a doubt, he would feel safe with them. He was the one that recruited them. He was the one that made them. They were making major money with him.
As a result, he didn't even bother to carry a gun. At the height of his success, not only was Galante shifting millions of dollars worth of heroin a year, he was taking charge as head of the family. And surrounded by loyal guards, he thought he was invulnerable. The fact was, whilst Galante was seemingly in charge, the respect accorded him was often fickle, and Galante failed to appreciate the looming danger. His money was making other mobsters jealous, and many still refused to recognize his status as self-proclaimed head of the family. Especially supporters of the imprisoned Bonanno family boss, Philip Ristelli. Ristelli hated that Galante was exploiting the power vacuum and trying to steal his job. So as the summer heat began to settle on New York, dark forces were at work.
One faction of the Bonanno family did not like him heading the family. They made an alliance with a faction of the Gambino family, the underboss, Nello Della Croce, who was very, very powerful for an underboss.
This alliance with Della Croce would prove to be deadly. On July the 12th, 1979, Galante's driver dropped him off at Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue. It was his cousin's restaurant, and Galante was visiting to wish him well on a forthcoming trip.
Now you have to see the layout. I'll give you the layout. It's a long, narrow restaurant. You come in the front door off Knickerbocker Avenue, and in the back of the restaurant, there's a garden cafe with tables and chairs.
He ate there many times. He had his 2 trusted bodyguards who were armed.
With Cesare Bonaventre and Baldo Amato watching over him, he felt safe.
He had a friend that he met there. He had the restaurant owner. They had just had a big meal.
He's about to light a cigar when the 3 shooters come in.
These 3 people walked in and just blew them away.
Galante was gunned down, cigar in mouth. Joe Terrano, the cousin, was also felled. So too was the other lunch companion, Leonardo Coppolo. News of the shooting reached police detective Bill Clark.
I'm riding in the car and I hear a job come over the radio. Shots fired, 3 guys with ski masks. Sounded like it might be the real deal.
The police rushed to the restaurant. The scene inside was horrific.
The crime scene at Joe and Mary's restaurant was chaos.
Well, when you stepped into the yard, the first person that probably was shot was the owner of the restaurant, Mr. Terrano. He was laying right there with a head wound. Just on the other side of this table with a big gallon of red wine was Carmine, and he had fallen back in his chair. He had the cigar in his mouth. And then around the other side of the table in the corner was Leonardo Coppolo, and his brains were just laying out next to him. And I didn't know who these people were at the time, so I took his wallet out, and it was him. So I got on the phone, I called the chief of detectives, I called my borough, my boss, everybody, let everybody know.
Local news photographers managed to grab a shot of Galante, splayed out by the unfinished meal. It became an iconic image of the Mafia's bloody reality.
That was the famous picture that went out across the world.
It was such a perfect hit that it entered Mafia folklore. As investigators dug deeper, they soon realized it was a carefully devised assassination.
It was well planned because a car was waiting for them outside the restaurant, and they got away with it.
The getaway car was recovered a few blocks away. And there was an even greater puzzle. Where were the Zip bodyguards? Witnesses spoke of two other men in leather jackets, fitting the description of Cesare Bonaventre and Baldo Amato, hurrying away from the crime scene. It looked like the Zip bodyguards, supposed to protect Galante, had betrayed him. For the New York police and the FBI, it became one of their most high-profile cases. They needed to solve it to show they were coming down hard on organized crime. In the end, the only clue as to what had gone on came thanks to a stroke of good luck. Covert surveillance of a meeting of Gambino family men at a social club showed something interesting.
They started the camera going right across from the Ravenite Social Club of everything happening there.
They saw some of the Bonanno faction come over and give high fives with Nello Della Croce's people there.
These guys go up and it's like Anello Della Croce, big hug and kiss, and it was like, you know, it was everything but a touchdown signal in the end zone. This is right after the Galante killing.
And that really gave us the information that it was a mob commission sanctioned hit.
The surveillance evidence would lead to the only conviction to date. One of the group, Anthony Bruno Indelicado, was charged as one of Galante's masked killers. No one else stood trial. This included the two Zips seen fleeing the shooting.
They turned themselves in to be interviewed a couple of days later, and they had their attorney with them, and they refused anything I asked them.
The motive for the murder, however, was clear. Galante had become rich through drugs and refused to share his wealth. This had made enemies both inside and outside his own family.
It was just too much money for them to pass up. You know, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars.
His determination to replace Rastelli as Bonanno family boss merely added to the list of those who wanted to kill him.
It's one of those situations where you make a lot of enemies, and your enemies get together and decide you should go.
There's a clue as to why the Zips turned on him. After Galante's death, Cesare Bonaventre took over his heroin business. He continued to distribute the drug by exploiting what became known as the pizza connection, and Bonaventre made even more money.
Just the cell that I was involved in was bringing in $1 million a day. So that's $350 million a year. You know, major Fortune 500 companies don't make that type of money. And that's how big it was.
But a chance encounter on an airliner ended the pizza connection era. Bundles of cash wrapped in aprons from a pizza parlor gave away the network.
Federal law enforcement officials are celebrating what they consider to be a major victory in their war against organized crime. A former head of the Sicilian Mafia and 16 other reputed organized crime figures convicted yesterday of running one of the biggest heroin smuggling rings ever uncovered.
A showcase trial in 1985 brought the pizza connection to an end. Since Galante's death and the dismantling of the pizza connection, the Mafia's involvement in drugs has waned. Other ethnic groups moved in, and new drugs rose in popularity. The French connection has been replaced by new smuggling routes and new drug lords. As for Carmine Galante, his legacy is unusual even by Mafia standards. He showed that focus and sheer determination could get you far and fast, even after 12 years in prison. But his spectacular killing showed you can be too ambitious and too greedy, even for the Mafia.
He wanted to be the guy. He wanted to be the geek. But he never made it.
Carmine was stepping up into a position that they didn't want him in, and that's what got him killed.
Galante was a ruthless street rat thug who certainly got what he deserved.
In the end, he was so loathed that he was even refused a Catholic funeral mass. What's more, that rare thing in Mafia circles, he was buried surrounded by just a tiny group of close family. Few of his wider crime family bothered to pay respect. A true sign in the Mafia of an unloved and feared man. A final insult for someone hated by those who knew him. Sam Giancana was the most flamboyant gangster of them all, when organized crime was at its most extravagant.
I'd say he was far more powerful than Al Capone, and he was a giant.
He had a beautiful showbiz girlfriend. He was pals with Frank Sinatra.
Sam Giancana didn't like to keep a low profile. He liked the big life. He liked to be seen with the stars.
He was worth millions and had the power of life or death.
He killed a lot of people, had a lot of people killed.
One cold stare from you and it could cause you to become very concerned.
If you crossed him, you were in deep trouble.
But in helping elect a clean young president and assisting in the CIA's murkiest operations, his career sees the Mafia and politics mix into a deadly cocktail. The pursuit of Sam Giancana is the ultimate story of the state versus the mob. And the final chapter is one of the most notorious Mafia hits of all. Sam Giancana had learned his gangster trade from Al Capone's top enforcers. He excelled as a driver, delivering killers to murder their victims and evade the cops. He learned how to lend money and collect the interest.
Hey, Sam, loan me a $5. I got to go get something. He said, what do you take for security? And Sam said, how about a lie?
His furious outbursts were so savage that people around him wondered about his mental stability.
He was violent. But the people in the Chicago outfit almost are all violent. They kill people with the drop of a hat.
He was a killer. Aged just 18, Giancana was charged with murder, but escaped conviction.
When I first saw Sam Giancana, I thought, there is the arrogance, the hatred, the violence, the viciousness that I've dedicated my career to fighting.
For the mob, Giancana's greatest strength was not his violent nature, but his gift for making money. It was Giancana who struck fear into the electricians' union so that every slot machine in Chicago paid the mob. It was Giancana who muscled the black gambling kings out of Chicago with threats and murder. Under his watchful eye, millions of dollars poured in from casinos in Las Vegas and Cuba. And by 1957, aged 49, Sam Mooney Giancana was boss of the Chicago outfit.
Sam Giancana was the most powerful criminal chief in the history of the United States. He had his tentacles into the police, to the courts, to the business world around Chicago.
But just as Giancana reached the top, the government turned on organized crime. An eager young lawyer began fighting to see him and his kind fall. Robert Kennedy.
The nation's underworld gets the unwelcome spotlight of publicity as the Senate's Investigations Subcommittee begins new hearings on crime. Arkansas Senator
The Senate Labor Rackets Committee was investigating mafia corruption of the trade unions. Robert Kennedy, as chief legal counsel, made a name for himself by questioning witness after witness about their mob connections.
Did you say that SOB, I'll break his back? Who did you make it about?
I don't know. I may have been discussing somebody in a figure of speech.
Well, who did you make the statement? Whose back were you going to break?
I don't even remember it.
Well, whose back were you going to break, Mr. Hoffa?
Figure of his speech, I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, it was real-life drama, and it was exciting to watch.
On the 9th of June, 1959, the witness was Sam Giancana.
Could you tell us whether if you have opposition from anybody that you dispose of them by having them stuffed in a trunk? Is that what you do, Mr. Giancana? Would you tell us...
Giancana refused to answer Kennedy's questions by taking what is known in America as the Fifth Amendment.
When you take the Fifth, you say essentially, I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that my answer might tend to incriminate me, and nobody can touch you for it.
Sam Giancana asserted his Fifth Amendment rights over 30 times.
Declined to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate me.
Chief Counsel Robert Kennedy seemed frustrated and goaded the gangster.
Will you tell us anything about any of your operations, or just giggle every time I ask you a question?
Declined to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate me.
I thought only little girls giggled, Mr. Giancana.
Bobby Kennedy's theatrics were perhaps intended to light Giancana's famously short fuse.
I think he was hoping that Giancana would explode. But, you know, I never thought he really gave a damn.
Round one in this long, bitter feud went to Sam Giancana. Kennedy could get nothing on him. And there was a reason why the Chicago boss felt untouchable. He was well connected to the Kennedys. Robert Kennedy's big brother, Senator John F. Kennedy, had set his sights on the White House. But just to become the Democrat presidential candidate was a battle. A Boston Irish Catholic couldn't get elected to anything in staunchly Protestant states of 60s America like Wisconsin and West Virginia. The wealthy Kennedy clan would have to buy support in these key primary elections, so they reached out to an influential family friend for help. Frank Sinatra.
Sinatra was a friend of the Kennedy family, and Jack Kennedy in particular.
Frank, in his turn, had a friend and business partner who knew all about getting his way in politics. Sam Giancana.
I have every reason to believe that there was mob money in the West Virginia election. The person who handled the money was Frank Sinatra.
Before voters went to the polls, Giancana sent one of his men to spread $50,000 around West Virginia. He sweetened local politicians with new office furniture and paid bar owners to keep Sinatra's campaign song, High Hopes, playing on jukeboxes across the state. Giancana's efforts seemed to help get the Kennedys over the first hurdle. John F. Kennedy became the Democrat candidate to run for president. But an even bigger challenge lay ahead. In November 1960, John Kennedy faced the sitting Vice President, Richard Nixon, in the race for the White House. The election was too close to call. Pundits were saying that whoever won the state of Illinois would win the presidency. And the key to Illinois was Sam Giancana's backyard, Chicago. Giancana's Chicago outfit knew all about how to swing votes in their city. They'd been doing it for generations.
In this city, no criminal enterprise is going to work until they've got the politicians in their pocket. He had the politicians, and I mean all of them.
One ruse was to send scores of people from precinct to precinct, illegally voting in each one. Another well-worn trick was ghost voting, impersonating deceased residents of a precinct. Mob-controlled unions were prevailed upon to vote Kennedy to a man. There were even claims that Giancana's hoods intimidated voters at the polling stations.
Listening to the radio, listening to the returns coming in, it was obvious that there was a theft underway.
Not since 1916 had the presidential election result been so close. Kennedy beat Nixon by just 0.1%.
Somewhat afternoon on the day after the election, Senator Kennedy received a telegram from the vice president congratulating him on his victory. With this in his pocket,
Sam Giancana was quick to claim that it was he who had elected Kennedy to the White House. While most dispute this, Giancana certainly expected payback.
Giancana can legitimately think that he had done his work and that he had tipped it and that he could expect some result.
Giancana expected the new Kennedy administration to get Bobby off his back. He told an associate,
"Bobby will just be another goddamn lawyer soon. They promised me they'll take care of him."
I am, in my mind, convinced that there was a deal cut. That if Giancana would get Illinois for the Democrats, that he would be given free hand.
Giancana prophesied to the outfit a lessening of government harassment in Chicago and Las Vegas. He couldn't have been more mistaken. New President John F. Kennedy appointed his brother, Bobby, to the government post of Attorney General.
I have felt that we should secure the best talent we could get for every position, regardless of party, regardless of any other factor. This test has been applied, and it's been applied in this case.
Far from being just another lawyer, as Attorney General, the fanatical mob-chasing Robert Kennedy was now the country's top law enforcement officer. It was a shock for Giancana and the Chicago outfit.
The last thing they thought was they would get Robert Kennedy as the Attorney General. Anybody but Robert Kennedy. That was a surprise.
Bobby Kennedy, now in charge of the Department of Justice and the FBI, declared war on the Mafia.
I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time. I think a lot of steps can be taken in order to deal with the problem. I think it's gotten much more serious over the period of the last 10 years.
Giancana cursed at the sight of the Attorney General and fumed at the very mention of the Kennedy name. To him, Bobby Kennedy's war on organized crime was a betrayal. But as the Justice Department went to war, Sam Giancana fell in love. Phyllis McGuire was the lead singer of the headlining trio, the McGuire Sisters. She was 29. Giancana was 52. It seems violent Mo Giancana could be charming.
And he wasn't flashy. It was just direct, and it was strength, and his eyes were, it's like they looked through you.
She was a big star, stunningly beautiful, and he loved to be seen out with her on his arm. Giancana began to flood her with gifts of furs, cars, and jewelry. Cash had always bought him the most beautiful escorts, but this was different. He began to neglect business in Chicago, to follow Phyllis to performances all over the US. He even accompanied her on a 2-week European tour. The tough mob boss had a chink in his armor, a weak spot the government would later use to help bring him down. While Giancana was romancing Phyllis, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy was hard at work radically reforming the Department of Justice and the FBI.
He was extremely driven. He absolutely hated what he called the outfit, the Mafia, organized crime.
To the 10 FBI agents assigned to Chicago, Kennedy added 60 more. Giancana called them G-men, or just the G. At first he was unconcerned, dismissing them as Boy Scouts. Up to now, their track record against organized crime had not been good. But Kennedy was changing the game. The FBI agents that descended on Giancana were a new breed. They were all clean-cut, college-educated men. Many were lawyers. Above all, the biggest problem for Sam Giancana was that these government men had a fanatical commitment to their incorruptibility. Unlike other Chicago law enforcement, Giancana couldn't buy them. Robert Kennedy was also increasing the number of lawyers in the Justice Department's Organized Crime and Racketeering section from 17 to 63. He rebuilt the whole operation.
You can think of the Department of Justice as a aircraft carrier, and you can't turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. They don't have brakes. You can slow it down and steer it. He turned it on a dime and took it in a different direction.
The Attorney General funded his new crack team of investigators well. His goal was to get all government agencies working together as never before, to break the grip of organized crime.
He talked directly to you. It gave us a whole feeling of electricity in what we were doing and commitment to what we were doing.
We did feel that we were kind of like the new untouchables.
Giancana was now closely watched by the new FBI agents in Chicago.
The view is fine and the kids are still in school. Over.
His HQ was in the back of the Armory Lounge Bar and Restaurant in Chicago's Forest Park suburb. Despite FBI surveillance, his private business remained secret behind closed doors.
Eyeball one to dugout.
I read you loud and clear.
Or so he thought.
10-3, eyeball one. Stay with it.
The G-men had a new weapon that would turn Giancana's world upside down. Electronic surveillance.
Bobby Kennedy decided that organized crime was an issue of national security. It was a threat to the United States and fell in that category that you could exercise a wiretap and install a wiretap without a warrant.
The number of FBI bugs and wiretaps in America exploded from just a handful to hundreds. The FBI agents Romer and Hill, assigned to monitor Giancana, were quick to hide a microphone in the Holy of Holies, his HQ, the Armory Lounge. The G-men overheard Potsy Poe, an old associate, complaining about them to Mooney Giancana.
I never thought it'd be this fucking rough. You told me when they put his brother in there, we're going to see some fireworks. Well, I never knew it would be like this. This is murder. Concentrate on a certain individual. You mean the outfit? Yeah.
The agents heard exactly how Giancana ran the outfit. Although officially the boss, he received advice from senior mob figures and retired boss Tony Accardo.
Listen, Mo. Oh, we aren't here to try to twist your mind. We're just giving you what's practical. Practical advice, that's all. We're not here to try to distort you.
The tapes also revealed how Giancana advised his driver and bodyguard, Butch Blasi, about the Mafia Code of Silence, Omerta. He warned about the penalties for blabbing mob business to outsiders.
There was a stuffed fish over the bar, and he points up to the stuffed fish and says,
You know how that fish got that way? He opened his mouth.
and of course he's saying this into a bug himself, but he's telling Butch Blasi to don't talk about all that kind of stuff.
FBI agents Romer and Hill, in their surveillance of Giancana, did their utmost to exploit his weak spot, the relationship with Phyllis McGuire. They watched Sam and Phyllis closely, very closely. They took photos and shot moving footage of them together when they went out. With wiretaps and bugs, they also listened when they stayed in, even recording their conversation in their bedrooms. Whether in Las Vegas, or Maryland, Pittsburgh, or Atlantic City. The pressure of tight surveillance got to Sam Giancana. His acid anger was fired at the G-men whenever he saw them.
Now Roman, he spots us. He says, "Hello, Mo," and he walks away. So we move out of there, into the other room, and who the fuck walks in but that shit Hill?
Giancana started to lose control. He antagonized the agents and hissed obscenities. Retired boss Accardo was concerned that Giancana would do something stupid.
Don't call them dirty words or anything. Don't pay attention. Just walk away from them. Let them talk. You guys, holler and go fuck yourselves and this and that. The bastards, they're just like us. They got a job to do. We know what to do, and we do it. I know.
Bobby Kennedy was tightening the noose. But one government agency had jeopardized all his work by secretly seeking Giancana's help: the CIA. The consequences for the agency and for Giancana would eventually be dire. Giancana and many other gangsters had once had vast, lucrative business interests on the island of Cuba, just a short hop from Miami. In exotic and poverty-stricken Cuba, white tourists with green dollars could live like royalty and lose money in the comfort of the mob-owned casino hotels.
Cuba was a gold mine for the mob. There's a lot of money made down there in the casinos and the joints, and Castro took it away completely.
On New Year's Day, 1959, Fidel Castro's rebel forces swept into Havana and, with popular support, supplanted the old mob-friendly regime of President Batista. Castro swiftly nationalized land and American businesses. He cost the mob and the U.S. government untold millions of dollars.
The mob, they were running Cuba. They were running amok down there under Batista. And when Castro came in, he threw them all out. So they were not happy with him. If they could get rid of Castro, they could move back in.
It wasn't just the mob who wanted Castro gone. The CIA saw Castro as a dangerous communist on America's doorstep, and they wanted him swept away.
So who would you go to? You go to mob guys who had good connections in Cuba. They'd operated there for years and are pretty good at killing people.
On the basis that my enemy's enemy is my friend, the CIA met Giancana and associates to try to arrange a gangland hit on Cuba's president, Fidel Castro.
They're certainly naive about the organized crime. They're not a hit squad. You can't buy them to kill people. They thought they could.
At a clandestine meeting at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, the CIA wanted a Capone-style attack, with Castro going down in public in a hail of bullets. The real-life gangsters demurred, wanting to keep things nice and clean. Giancana suggested something much more CIA, using pills to poison Castro's food and drink. The CIA took his advice. But when a US government agency secretly commissioned murder from gangsters, they should have seen trouble coming.
And once you've dealt with them and they've given you something, then they have a right to ask for something back. And you don't want a reciprocal relationship with them. You're compromised.
Master manipulator Giancana soon turned the situation to his advantage. First, he's working for the CIA, and then somehow, they find themselves working for him. Giancana suspected Phyllis McGuire of having an affair in Las Vegas with top showbiz comedian Dan Rowan. He talked his CIA contact into arranging to plant a microphone in Rowan's hotel room. But the operation went terribly wrong. The installation engineers were discovered by hotel staff and arrested by police. The CIA feared the mob connection and Castro assassination plot would get out.
The agency did not want that plotting to come public, and they were afraid to death of any public examination of Giancana.
To avoid a public trial, a deeply embarrassed CIA Director of Security, Sheffield Edwards, had to confess in a memo to the FBI the whole sordid affair. When he found out, the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, was furious.
And he called Sheffield Edwards in to his offices. And what he said was, the next time you do something like that, you talk to me first.
One day, all this would come back to haunt both the CIA and Sam Giancana. FBI agents Roma and Rutland, watching and being verbally abused by Giancana in Chicago, now put even more pressure on the beleaguered outfit boss. Determined to drive him over the edge, the agents implemented what they called lockstep surveillance. Every day, round the clock, they were with him, following in cars. When he got out, they got out. When he walked, they walked within feet of him. They followed him on his golf round, rushing his game, jeering from the edge of the greens.
They were like this. He played golf, they were behind him, just everywhere he went. And it sent him off like a Roman candle.
They even followed him into restaurants. If he went to the restroom, an agent would also go and stand at the next urinal, which made it difficult for him to do what he had gone there to do.
It was pure, simple harassment. They weren't getting anything out of that.
Roma and Rutland were right about one thing. It drove Giancana mad. An electronic surveillance recording made in June 1963 reveals that his mob associates thought he was becoming dangerously irrational.
That fucking Giancana. Wait till you hear what he's done now. He's not making good decisions.
What happened?
Charlie McCarthy told Roma that Mo told him to tell Kennedy to talk to him through Sinatra.
For Christ's sake, that's a cardinal rule. You don't give up a legit guy. He tells Roma that Sinatra's our guy to Kennedy?
More or less. I'm so fucking mad I could jump out your window. We gotta do something about this. The G is driving this man goofy.
A maddened Giancana lashed out in a way the mob would never understand. He sued the FBI, saying their lockstep operation violated his civil rights. Giancana's lawyer hired a film crew to shoot the FBI lockstep in action. In a darkened courtroom, the judge was also shown Giancana's respectable lifestyle. Playing a round of golf, going to church, and visiting his father's grave. An injunction against lockstep surveillance was granted. The FBI agents would have to keep their distance. Sam Giancana had, for the moment, beaten the FBI. But Giancana's victory soon evaporated. And to escape the continual scrutiny, he and Phyllis holidayed at Sinatra's home in Palm Beach, and then in Las Vegas. Meanwhile, the FBI was recording some disturbing mobster conversations.
Kennedy, a guy should take a knife and stab and kill that fucker. I mean it. This is true. Honest to God. Right in the White House. Somebody's got to get rid of that fucker.
The Kennedys' war against organized crime was fueling a dark mood among gangsters all over the United States.
They should kill the whole family. My mother and father, too.
Just a few months later, on November the 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated during a Dallas motorcade. The killing spawned a rash of conspiracy theories about who might be responsible.
There was always a strong rumor that the mob had something to do with the assassination of John Kennedy.
The rumors of Mafia involvement were fed when it was revealed that the man who gunned down Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was mob fixer Jack Ruby. It didn't go unnoticed that Sam Giancana had sought Ruby's help from time to time. But despite the rumors, there has never been anything to substantiate claims that the mob had any part in it. President Kennedy's death did, however, give the mob what it wanted: the immobilization of his gang-busting brother.
I think he was simply crushed and shocked by it.
An FBI informant heard Giancana's reaction. What he said was chilling.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy will not have the power that he did.
Within a year, the new president appointed a different attorney general, and Robert Kennedy was gone. Giancana thought the pressure was off. But Bobby Kennedy had rebuilt the Justice Department to smash organized crime. Even without him, the machinery worked on. Crucially, Kennedy had inspired a generation of investigative lawyers who would not give up the fight. One of Bobby's boys was a young lawyer in the Department of Justice strike force, David Shippers.
Always there was this Sam Giancana hanging out there, the one guy that nobody seemed to be able to touch. All he had to do was surface once, and we'd be able to put him into a conspiracy of some kind. Couldn't find anything.
Shippers' problem was a lack of hard evidence. The FBI agent's years of electronic surveillance put Giancana at the center of extortion, illegal gambling, and murder. But as the bugs were installed under presidential prerogative and not by a judicial warrant, the thousands of hours of incriminating recordings were not admissible as evidence in court. But determined to put Giancana behind bars, Shippers meticulously constructed a cunning legal snare. First, to question Giancana about his criminal career, Shippers awoke the dormant power of an investigative grand jury.
Without the grand jury, we were dead in the water. We couldn't do a thing because we had no personal subpoena power. It was a grand jury that had the subpoena power.
If you're subpoenaed to the grand jury, you got no choice. You got to show up. You may take the Fifth Amendment, but you're going to get dragged in there.
Second, Shippers had to stop Giancana hiding behind the Fifth Amendment by removing any possibility that he could incriminate himself.
If what you're saying can never be used against you, then the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply. That's where the use of immunity came in.
Granting immunity from prosecution to a top Mafia boss was a bold step, and a hard sell to Shippers' boss, the U.S. Attorney.
The U.S. Attorney looked at me and he said, "Are you nuts? Are you crazy?" They said, "Well, you don't really think he would talk." We wouldn't immunize him if we didn't think he'd talk. If he doesn't talk, we'll put him in jail. If he does talk, we're going to have one heck of a great case. We'll break the whole stupid Mafia.
At last, the trap was set. But would Giancana take the bait? In December 1964, the federal grand jury investigation began. To soften Giancana up, Shippers summoned his mob associates to question them in secret. Giancana feared they might be spilling their guts, but he couldn't be sure. Then, to play even more on Giancana's increasing paranoia, Shippers exploited his weak spot. He subpoenaed Phyllis McGuire.
So here comes Phyllis McGuire. We're going to put her in the grand jury. I just assumed she's going to come in and answer our questions. And the questions would essentially have been about her association, nothing embarrassing. She was the key to this whole thing.
Phyllis seemed shaken by the experience. Whether she actually testified or asserted her Fifth Amendment rights and declined to answer is still secret. But the thought that Phyllis had told them anything sent the paranoid Giancana crazy.
You know, he said over the weekend that he was pretty angry with you. Have you talked to him about it?
No comment.
Well, the word came back to us that Sam Giancana was ready to kill himself.
Is this an indication, do you think, that your relationship is all over?
No comment.
because he thought, if she talked, I'm in trouble.
David Shippers scheduled Giancana straight after Phyllis and made sure he reinforced Sam's fears when they met just before questioning.
I had a transcript of another individual's testimony in some case. It was about a half-inch thick. And we had the court reporter put a page on top that said, "Testimony of Phyllis McGuire." And I know Sam saw it.
Shippers had Giancana right where he wanted him, on the witness stand. The Chicago boss thought he knew the rules of this game. He'd plead the Fifth Amendment to each question and go home as usual. But he didn't realize David Shippers had changed the rules.
I remember the judge saying to him, "Mr. Giancana, if you received a traffic ticket on the way in here today, nobody can touch you. You are immune from any prosecution for any crime as of this moment."
Immunity effectively stripped Giancana of Fifth Amendment protection.
And then it really hit him when the judge told him he was immune and he had to talk. He was ordered to testify. Then it hit him.
The single-minded purpose of David Shippers seemed to remind Giancana of an old adversary.
He turned to me and he said, "You're one of Bobby's boys, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am."
Giancana had no choice. If he talked and lied, he was certain to perjure himself. If he talked and told the truth, the mob would kill him. Giancana gave his name and address, invoked the Fifth, and the trap was sprung. Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit, by refusing to answer questions, was in contempt of court and taken straight to jail.
Sam Giancana was totally awed. He was rattled. He couldn't understand how this could happen.
The judge commented that Giancana had the key to his own cell. He would be released when he decided to answer the grand jury's questions. But in the outfit, you don't talk. Giancana kept his mouth shut. This was a government victory of sorts, as it was the first time he'd been in prison for over 20 years.
That rocked the whole organized crime around the country.
But was it such a great victory? Giancana could only be held in jail until the grand jury folded a year later. On the night Giancana was released, in May 1966, there was a party at his home in Oak Park, but senior mobsters found nothing to celebrate. The outfit old guard decided Mo Giancana's high profile and volatile temper was bad for business. They gave the FBI a belated victory by stripping Sam Giancana of his rank as boss and throwing him out of Chicago for good. Giancana left the U.S. to live in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Over the years, he built a new life for himself. No G-men dogged his steps or monitored his phone calls. And Giancana returned to what he did best, making money. In the mid-60s, as NASA prepared to put a man on the moon, Giancana was launching a gambling operation on cruise ships in the Caribbean. While the US tore itself apart over the Vietnam War, Giancana's international ambitions met with success in Guatemala and with the Shah of Iran. In 1968, his old adversary, Robert Kennedy, ran for president. But on the campaign trail, he was gunned down and killed. And although the 70s saw an aging Giancana undergo abdominal surgery, he enjoyed a quiet, wealthy life. Then, suddenly, a dark episode from his past cast a chill shadow over Sam Giancana, his connection to the CIA. In January 1975, a Senate Select Committee began investigating illegal CIA operations, specifically CIA involvement in plans to assassinate Castro. Its findings would shock Chairman Senator Church.
It is simply intolerable that any agency of the government of the United States may engage in murder.
The committee was very interested in hearing from any mobsters consulted by the CIA in their Castro assassination plots. Although lying low in Mexico, Giancana had been snatched from his hideaway and suddenly found himself deported back into the United States. The press were waiting.
Giancana, why did you have to leave Mexico, sir?
Why? I don't know.
Mr. Giancana, what are your future plans?
The future plans of one-time boss Giancana were to re-establish his cut of Chicago outfit operations.
Once he arrived in Chicago, he announced to the entire organization that he was back and he was the man.
But a new generation ran the Chicago outfit. They had no room for the aging Giancana.
By that time, a lot of his rivals were in the penitentiary or dead because of what we'd been doing to them.
Knocked out of action in Chicago, Giancana received a subpoena that ordered him to appear before the Senate Committee without fail in Washington, D.C. on June the 24th, 1975. But Sam Giancana never made it. On June the 19th, 1975, 4 days after celebrating his 67th birthday, Sam Giancana was at home in Oak Park, Chicago. He was cooking in his basement kitchen. Routine police patrols noticed nothing unusual. Health problems meant he could not eat spicy foods. So it seems the sausage and peppers was a late-night snack for a friend. A friend Giancana liked and trusted. A close friend. But the Mafia hadn't quite finished with Sam Giancana. The way he was killed showed that the mob no longer trusted him to keep quiet.
He was shot in the mouth, so that you might draw the conclusion that somebody was leaving a message. Don't talk.
It was somewhat interesting that somebody that powerful was killed, so there had to be a major decision among the powers that be in the mob.
Sam Giancana's extraordinary career had lasted over 50 years, spanning the heyday of organized crime in America. In the years after Giancana, show business stars began to shun any mob connection. The glamorous image of gangsters became tarnished. People realized they were just killers. Never again would a mafia boss be so closely associated with the bright stars of show business or the dark underbelly of politics. The FBI and the Justice Department had struck the first serious blows aimed at breaking the mafia. Benny Siegel, better known as Bugsy, was tall, good-looking, and charismatic, a charmer and a womanizer. He was also a gangster and a killer. He was a man with enemies. Late one June evening in 1947, he arrived at the Los Angeles home of his mistress with a friend. Siegel's mistress was away, and the two men made themselves at home. As with most mob killings, the murder of Bugsy Siegel was never solved. But the one name always associated with Siegel's death is the one name he would have least expected, that of his best friend, Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was one of the most mysterious of all mob figures.
Little Meyer, quite tough, but not really a violent man.
For some, he was the Jewish mastermind behind the Mafia, pulling the strings from the shadows.
He was a financial genius of organized crime. He was also a killer, part of the New York Mafia, and very powerful and very successful.
But for others, he was little more than a middle manager for the mob. His sinister reputation, the product of media hype and hysteria.
The cold, hard evidence suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was, or that he thought he was himself.
Mob mastermind, or victim of his own legend. We unravel the enigma of Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky arrived in America in 1911 as an 8-year-old boy. He and his family were Jewish immigrants fleeing the brutal anti-Semitic pogroms of their native Russia.
He was scarred by what he saw as a small child. I think Meyer was rather focused on anti-Semitism and his belief that he is not going to lay down the way the Jews in Russia or Poland did, and the way he even felt his father did. And a lot of what Meyer felt being Jewish was not putting up with abuse and fighting back.
His family soon settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, New York's impoverished Jewish ghetto.
He grew up in a pretty tough district in New York. And whatever your size was, you had to be tough. You had to be able to take a beating and give a beating. And so and he was small.
Just 5 feet 4 inches, Meyer Lansky quickly learned to use his fists and was soon in trouble with the law. It was at this time he'd first met another young Jewish hoodlum called Bugsy Siegel. The meeting happened when Siegel became involved in a street brawl.
Siegel had these charismatic good looks, and he got involved in a fight, a street fight, and he picked up a gun, and he was so transfixed with the fury of the fight and his anger that he raised the gun and was about to shoot somebody, and they could hear the police coming from all directions. It was only when Meyer sort of physically restrained him and pushed him away that he was able to save him. He said that was the beginning of their friendship, and that, of course, was actually the nature of their relationship.
Lansky was the brains, Siegel was the brawn. Together, the two young men formed the Jewish Bugs and Meyer gang.
You sort of get this sense that, oh, organized crime is Italian. But early in the century, the Jewish rackets were very, very powerful.
The gang stood up to the Italian and Irish toughs that came into their neighborhood to beat up Jews. They also engaged in more lucrative activities.
They were involved in what we'll call small-time criminal activities. Hijacking, loan sharking, gambling.
Lansky and Siegel's big break came in 1920 with the introduction of prohibition, the ban on the consumption of alcohol, a ban which spawned a lucrative illegal trade for mobsters of all ethnic groups.
It was prohibition that turned all of these low-level street predatory criminals into business executives because they had to figure out how to manufacture or import, distribute, sell, run real organizations.
The Bugs and Meyer gang was soon carving a niche for itself in New York's brutal gang wars. It was at this time that Lansky made what would be the second key alliance of his life, with Italian mobster Charles Lucky Luciano, a man whose respect Lansky first earned when they were teenagers, and Luciano tried to rob him.
Famously, Luciano tried to shake him down, and Meyer told him, in no uncertain terms, in very colorful language, where he could get off. You think that because I'm Jewish, I'm just going to fork over money. That's not going to happen today, buddy.
It was the start of one of the most important friendships in the history of organized crime, and of a groundbreaking Sicilian-Jewish alliance.
Luciano really didn't like the old-time Sicilian bosses, the notion that you only stick with your own. A lot of the newer, younger Italians, they didn't really care about the cultural precedent for setting up a gang. It had nothing to do with Sicily. They wanted to make money, and guys like Meyer, who were Jewish, wanted to make money.
With Lansky at his side, Luciano was soon shooting his way to the top of the New York underworld. By the summer of 1931, just one man stood between Luciano and total control. Salvatore Maranzano, a classic old-style Sicilian mob boss. Luciano turned to Lansky for help.
One of the stereotypes of the Jewish rackets is the Jewish guys handled the money and the Italian guys were the tough guys. Not true. Interestingly enough, when Luciano took over the Italian rackets, it was the Jewish muscle that played a big role.
The idea was that If you use Jewish gunmen, we get very ethnic now. If you use Jewish gunmen, the Italian criminals wouldn't be so suspicious because they wouldn't look like Italian hitmen or Sicilian hitmen.
At Luciano's bidding, Lansky organized a gang of Jewish assassins to visit Maranzano's offices on Park Avenue, posing as tax inspectors from the Inland Revenue Service.
One of the guys whose name was Red Levine, who was known for being an Orthodox Jew who would not kill on the Sabbath. But Maranzano was so bigoted that he felt if some Jewish bean counter IRS guys came to his office, they couldn't do him any harm. Well, not only did they do him harm, they killed him.
With Maranzano dead, Luciano became the king of New York and set about establishing the structures of the modern mafia. Meyer Lansky now sat at the right hand of the most powerful mobster in America. But he knew there would always be limits on his power.
Lansky could never be a leader for one reason. He could never be a member because he wasn't of Italian or Sicilian extract. He was a Jew and he knew his place. He was highly respected as somebody who had the ear of Luciano, who could talk to Luciano, and he was a great entrepreneur in criminal endeavors. But he was never a kingmaker or in a position of authority.
From now on, Lansky's role would be that of a chief executive in his various criminal enterprises. Powerful, but answerable ultimately to Sicilian bosses. By now, he'd married and quickly had 3 children, the oldest of whom, Buddy, suffered from cerebral palsy. Otherwise, life was good. He left the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side behind and took an apartment in the exclusive Majestic building, overlooking Central Park on New York's Upper West Side. With the abolition of Prohibition in 1933, he branched out into a new business, one that would dominate the rest of his life.
Meyer Lansky was brilliant mathematically, and his real interest was gambling because he had a knack for it.
Lansky was good with numbers. And the whole idea of gambling is you got to be quick with numbers, you got to know the odds.
He could tell you if it came to craps, well, the proportion for the table was 4.5, and if it was blackjack, it was 5.2.
Gambling was illegal, but widely tolerated, and Lansky was soon running casinos in New York, Florida, and a number of other states. Paradoxically, his casinos made money because they were honest.
The tables would not be fixed because he knew exactly how to take his profit without cheating anybody.
You don't have to be dishonest to win. You have to have volume. As long as you keep gambling, you'll lose.
By the end of the 1930s, Lansky's casinos had made him a wealthy man. But the little Jewish immigrant from the Lower East Side craved something more than wealth.
Right through Lansky's life, there is this wish to be respectable. And right through Lansky's life, there is this feeling that he is not a criminal, that he's a citizen like any other.
There is no doubt that the American people need an adequate merchant marine.
How did Joe Kennedy make his money? What was the foundation of the Kennedy family fortune? Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, and he was able to launder his fortune and use it to pay his son's way to become president of the United States. Meyer Lansky literally compared himself to Joe Kennedy, and felt he was no more immoral than that man had been.
He actually had a snobbish streak. This was somebody who studied history. This is somebody, when his friends were out carousing at night, would hire tutors.
Lansky sent his own second son, Paul, to study at the military academy, West Point.
He would jot down if he saw a vocabulary word that he was interested in. You can see in his handwriting, he would write about it in a book. I remember one of the things he wrote was, determine how to pronounce Thucydides.
The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and America's entry into the Second World War provided Lansky with an extraordinary and unexpected opportunity to prove his patriotism and win the respectability he craved. In February 1942, a large troop carrier called the Normandy caught fire and capsized in New York Harbor.
The death of a queen. Now the $60 million luxury liner lies on her side, mortally stricken.
The Navy suspected sabotage. Many of the men who worked on the docks were Italian, a nation America was now at war with. When the Navy attempted to investigate, they found the waterfront an impenetrable, closed world.
The longshoremen by nature are not the kind of guys who take well to men in uniform, government uniform, coming onto the docks and saying, I'd like you to snitch. So Roosevelt is distraught by this. Pearl Harbor has just happened. The Navy is explaining to him, Mr. President, we don't control the docks. And Roosevelt is, what do you mean we don't control the docks? We're the U.S. government. Well, Mr. President, you were governor of New York. Do you remember who ran the docks? Ah, okay.
At that time, the docks in New York were controlled by the mob.
The FBI and the war intelligence authorities suddenly realized the only way they were going to find out about what was going on the waterfront in New York was to actually come to terms with the so-called underworld, figures like Lucky Luciano. The trouble was, Luciano was in jail.
Luciano had been imprisoned in 1936 on charges of organizing prostitution. He was looking at a sentence of 30 to 50 years. The Navy needed a go-between. Enter Meyer Lansky, a Jew who already had impeccable anti-Nazi credentials. In the 1930s, New York's Jewish community had been threatened by the rise of the pro-Nazi German-American Bund. Jewish leaders had turned to Lansky, one of the few members of their community with the muscle to confront Nazi thugs.
The Bund found themselves under siege by Meyer's boys. Meyer and Ben Siegel, and Meyer actually personally went to some of these rallies. They would go and bust them up. They would hit them over the head with bats, and they would really terrorize these Bund members.
When the Navy approached him in 1942 to help them on the docks, Lansky immediately agreed to help. He arranged for Luciano to be moved to a more comfortable jail, closer to New York, and acted as a mediator in talks between the Navy and the Sicilian mobster.
It's an extraordinary story. Lansky says, can Luciano be moved? And then you see, because there was an official inquiry into this after the war, you see the actual documents saying, move Luciano, Mr. Meyer Lansky is going to come up and visit him. Do not request Mr. Lansky's passport. Do not take Mr. Lansky's fingerprints.
What then resulted was a deal where Luciano could meet with his men in prison, where he hadn't been able to do that before. And yes, he gave the order to cooperate with the Navy, but he also was allowed to conduct business.
It was an extraordinary deal, and it yielded almost immediate results. In June 1942, 8 Nazi spies were arrested following a tip-off from mob-controlled fishermen, an event later trumpeted by the FBI in this publicity film, although the Mafia's role in capturing the spies was not mentioned. The following year provided the mob with an even more dramatic opportunity to lend assistance to the war effort. The invasion of Sicily, home country of the Mafia.
Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano bring Sicilian assets, contacts in New York, to naval intelligence and help design the maps, determine what the tides were, what good invasion locations were, beach terrain, and where Nazi strongholds were.
As American troops poured ashore in Sicily, the mob assistance proved invaluable. But the Navy knew it was playing a dangerous game.
The only thing worse than Operation Underworld, as it was called, failing, what if it succeeds? You're now in business with the mob.
Sicily was conquered in just 6 weeks. But this was not a story that the US government wanted made public. The mob's wartime collaboration was hushed up. Charlie Luciano was released from prison, but immediately deported to Italy. As for Lansky, he found that in the eyes of the government, he remained a hoodlum. His patriotism had failed to win him respectability. And if he really wanted to leave the streets behind, there was another millstone hanging around his neck. Bugsy Siegel.
Siegel stayed on killing people even after Meyer kind of slid out of this, what they used to call the Bugs and Meyer mob. Bugsy Siegel was a wacko. He was a crazy guy, and he did a lot of the... I never saw any indication that Lansky himself ever killed anybody. Siegel, on the other hand, he enjoyed it, and he killed a lot of people. Now, how many, I don't know. Could have been 5, could have been 20.
Siegel had by now moved to California, where his film star looks helped gain him entree to the Hollywood set. But Siegel's dreams were focused elsewhere. A few hours' drive inland, a dusty desert stopover called Las Vegas.
There were these rundown gambling operations in this desert city, Las Vegas, that already existed there. What Siegel realized was these dusty, smoky, rundown places had potential to be something bigger.
The great advantage of Las Vegas was that it was in Nevada, the one state in the Union where gambling was legal. Siegel set about building his own luxury hotel casino, the Flamingo, the first in Las Vegas, with money borrowed from Lansky and other East Coast mobsters. The project quickly ran into trouble.
He never respected budgets. He thought that everything was limitless. And what starts as $1 million ends up becoming, you know what, it's not $1 million, I need 3. You know what, it's not 3, I need 6.
The situation was complicated by the influence of Siegel's girlfriend, glamorous former dancer and mob courier, Virginia Hill.
No.
Her abrasive personality would later be displayed before a Senate commission on organized crime.
I never got money from any of those fellas. None of those fellas. None of these that I've been reading about, and none that I knew. They never gave me anything.
Siegel's mob backers suspected Virginia Hill was stealing their money. But Bugsy Siegel was not the sort of man to listen to criticism of either himself or his girlfriend.
He was a very arrogant guy who would just basically tell him to go screw, you know, and he wasn't going to deal with these. He left it to Lansky to deal with these guys back in the East Coast.
Meyer pleaded with Ben Siegel to get things under control at the Flamingo, to start being more respectful of investors, to stop running around Hollywood going to parties. But you don't tell a 41-year-old man that you're not going to go trick-or-treating if you misbehave.
Eventually, the patience of Siegel's mob backers ran out. Just a few hours after Siegel's death, the Flamingo Hotel received a couple of visitors.
Two men, Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, walked to the Flamingo and said, we're in charge now. And somebody said, well, this is Ben Siegel's place. And they said, Ben is dead.
Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum were both business partners of Meyer Lansky's. It is inconceivable Lansky had been unaware of the fate that awaited his oldest friend. 40 years later, after Lansky's death, Lansky's second wife, Teddy, was asked about the murder.
I think he felt badly for the family, and they were buddies from the time they were youngsters.
There were reports that he was involved in the death.
I don't believe that. Circumstances sometimes make you think, but he would never directly have anything to do with anything like that.
Directly.
That's right.
Lansky may not have ordered Siegel's death, but he benefited. For all that he craved respectability, this was the life he'd chosen.
I suppose we could say there's a hypocrisy here. In all my research into Lansky, I never discovered him being personally responsible, personally fingering, personally instructing the death of anyone. But he made his money and he worked in an environment where murder was the ultimate sanction and where those who failed to stick by the code paid in that way.
The image of Lansky as a dangerous mobster was about to become forever established in the public consciousness. In 1950, the US Congress set up the Godfather Commission, its first ever probe into organized crime.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they? Paid my tax.
The commission focused primarily on the easy target of gambling, with the result that Lansky emerged as a far more important figure in organized crime than he was. Lansky was furious.
In one of the breaks in the hearings, Meyer said to Kefauver, Senator, I don't know what you have against gambling. You gamble. And Kefauver snapped, that's true, I do like gambling. I just don't want you people controlling it. You people. And one of the things that Meyer wrote in private notes is that gambling will become the biggest business in America once they run the Jewish and Italian boys. You people, out of it.
In fact, Senator Kefauver gambled on horses, which was perfectly legal. But for Lansky, it was another example of the hypocrisy of the establishment. The elite always looked upon gambling as an evil, Lansky wrote. Only when they used it as a pleasure or for the purpose of personal gain was it legitimate and not sinful. Once more, he felt he was a victim of anti-Semitism.
You you just had to say Jewish financier in the background, working with Italian mobsters. It played to so many stereotypes. It was so damning to Meyer Lansky's reputation. He never recovered from it.
In the aftermath of the Catawba Commission, there was a crackdown on illegal casinos of the type Lansky ran in New York, Florida, and other states.
Let this be a warning to all racketeers and gangsters that they of their ilk will not be tolerated in San Francisco.
For Lansky, his dream of respectability seemed further off than ever. But as one door closed, another opened. Cuba in the 1950s was Las Vegas by the sea.
Cuba was better. Havana was better than Las Vegas. First of all, it was closer to New York. It was close to Florida. They could bring these people on airplanes, you know, quickly, and lots of them. Bring the entertainers in. Have an open city with every kind of vice you could imagine, with girls and pornography and cockfights and whatever guys like. Havana was the best of the best.
Lansky was invited to Cuba in 1953 by Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista to help run the country's casinos.
When Lansky and some of his friends arrived, they were welcomed because they would run straight games. And then from Lansky's point of view, how marvelous to come to a country where they are not hypocritically denounced, but their skills are recognized.
Lansky helped turn Havana into America's playground, where the elite could enjoy all the vices denied them in the newly moralistic atmosphere back home. Among those who visited was future President John F. Kennedy.
Did Meyer know John Kennedy from Havana days, from trips there?
Yes.
What was he looking for in Havana? Gambling, women?
You said the second one.
Oh, a lot of people look for that in Havana.
Oh, yes. He told them where to go for it.
Lansky now embarked on his most ambitious project yet, the construction of the Riviera Hotel Casino on the Havana seafront.
We know from the evidence of the Riviera Hotel that by the mid-50s, he was worth $17, $18 million, which was a lot of money in those days. And he plowed it all into bricks and mortar and air conditioning and gold tiles and so on. It's a wonderful hotel by the standards of the 1950s. It's the first to have air conditioning. You go inside the casino, it's a wonderful mosaic tiled, egg-shaped room, still with all the glamour of a Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall film. And that's where he put his money.
It was the largest single investment Lansky ever made.
I think Meyer was focusing on Havana to clean up his fortune. That was going to be his Kennedy moment. Havana was legal.
But Lansky had bet wrong. By the time the Riviera opened in 1958, Fidel Castro's leftist rebels were closing in on the capital. In the early hours of New Year's Day, 1959, the dictator fled the country.
At first, the celebration was peaceful as shouting, cheering crowds surged through the city. Then the temper of the throng changed, and an ugly mob ranged the streets. Its prime targets, the symbols of the overthrown regime: the gambling casinos, the parking meters, the homes and businesses of Batista's cronies.
The casinos were looted and then seized by the new government.
When Castro came out of the hills, Lansky lost his money, Pepsi-Cola lost their money, United Tobacco lost their money, General Motors lost their money. All the big American corporations lost the money that they had. So the world's cleverest gambler, at the end of the day, made a bad gamble.
Lansky now moved permanently to Miami. He was almost 60 and in poor health, but his return to America coincided with a renewed offensive against organized crime.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia. This he describes as the government of organized gambling, narcotics peddling, extortion, racketeering, and controlling of certain trade unions.
With Bobby Kennedy at the Justice Department, the government had the Mafia in its sights. Lansky was still regarded as the mastermind of the mob and found himself under almost constant surveillance.
Meyer is being dogged 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by the authorities, by local authorities, by the FBI.
I knew them by heart. They were my buddies. If I saw them at the racetrack, I used to tell them, I'm going to report you to the FBI. You're not supposed to be gambling.
His wife, Teddy, one time was asked, did your husband have bodyguards? She said, yeah, the FBI. They were always there.
Listening bugs were placed in his house and at hotels he stayed in, but they yielded little. Spends much time lounging around his home, read this report from July the 7th, 1962. Main pursuits seem to be playing gin rummy with friends, watching TV, and reading.
All those wiretaps, bugs that the FBI did in the 1960s, every single bug was successful in getting good stuff, good intelligence for the FBI, except Lansky's. Lansky's was a total zero.
But the bugging did yield one conversation, which has gone down in mob folklore. It happened on the evening of May 27th, 1962. While subject and wife were watching television, the FBI report read, TV panelists referred to organized crime as being second only in size to the government itself. Lansky remarked to his wife that organized crime was bigger than US Steel. Lansky's exact words were not written down, and the tape was then reused, but the report was later leaked to the press. By the time the movie Godfather 2 was made in 1974, the scriptwriters had Hyman Roth, a character based on Lansky, narrowing his eyes and murmuring, "Michael, we're bigger than US Steel."
In fact, the record shows he did not say we are bigger than US Steel. And of course, since it's not recorded, we don't know in what tone he said it. Could he have been sardonic? Could he have been sarcastic and saying, it's bigger than US Steel? We don't know. But he himself would always say, when am I supposed to have said that? But of course, it stuck to him like a sort of catchphrase for the rest of his life, and of course, was finally immortalized on the silver screen.
In March 1970, police finally managed to arrest Lansky at Miami Airport on drugs charges.
The drug bust in 1970, I thought, was a travesty and a joke, because basic charge was that he left the country to go to Mexico for a vacation, I believe, and had these drugs on him without having a prescription for it.
The so-called drugs were in fact medicines for a stomach complaint.
I thought it was pure poppycock.
The case was thrown out, but Lansky had had enough. For 40 years, he had sought respectability and acceptance as an American citizen. Now, he turned his back on his adopted country. In July 1970, he moved to Israel and applied for citizenship.
All through his life, he has had this pride in his Jewish identity. He takes pride in the creation of the State of Israel, which puts into practice the toughness and the courage that he saw back in his youth in Grodno. And here's a whole country that embodies it.
Lansky is living in an exclusive resort hotel, the Acadia, north of Tel Aviv. He's not exactly in the market for publicity.
Lansky found himself pursued by the American media. But while in Israel, he granted Israeli TV a rare interview, presenting himself as a victim of persecution.
Mr. Lansky, if the accusations against you are false, why don't you go back to the United States and demand justice?
I think it would be terribly hard for one to get a fair trial, as much as I believe in the American courts.
Are you a religious Jew?
No, I'm not a religious Jew.
And what are...
But I'm a Jew. In my heart.
I think that there was probably a sense that we're all mishpucha, we're all family. And of course they're going to let me in. There's a law, the law of return. What they didn't bank on was that it would be a political hot potato.
The Americans were still pursuing Lansky and were pressuring for his return. The case was referred to Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir.
She didn't know Meyer Lansky from hole in the wall. And somebody said he wants to be a citizen of Israel, and she said, fine, I don't see any problem with that. And then another one of her advisors said, you know, we understand he's in the Mafia. Golda Meir said, Mafia? Mafia? No Mafia.
Lansky's application for citizenship was denied, and he was expelled from Israel. Lansky's wife, Teddy, arrived back in America literally spitting with fury.
Now look, go away from me, I'll kill you!
Lansky himself was immediately arrested. The government had finally succeeded in putting together a case against him, a case that rested on the evidence of a low-level mobster turned police informant called Fat Vinny.
Fat Vinny was Vincent Teresa, who was a hoodlum from Massachusetts. He was, a thief and an extortionist, and he had been a federal witness in 38 Mafia trials that the Department of Justice had brought.
Fat Vinny claimed that in 1968 he'd made 2 deliveries of cash to Meyer Lansky of income from the Colony Club Casino in London. It was the big break the government had been looking for.
Here's a guy who actually was willing to testify, who put money in Lansky's hands, $150,000. That's substantial compared to what his tax return said.
Like Al Capone 40 years before, Lansky was facing charges of tax evasion. Arriving at court, he was relaxed.
Are you pleased with the way your attorneys handled your defense?
I'm sorry, but no comment.
Well, you can't blame me for asking, can you?
No, I don't blame you at all.
Inside, the assistant prosecutor found a man very different from the one he had been expecting.
He was a gentleman, not a wise guy. It was clear that he'd read a lot. He was very articulate, very charming. If you didn't know any better, you'd think he was an executive of an American corporation.
The prosecution was led by a young Justice Department attorney, called R.J. Campbell.
We felt that if he had to defend himself, we could really get after him, because I had a mountain of material to cross-examine him on. So I was ready, prepared long and hard for Lansky to take the stand. He did not take the stand. What he did was put his wife on the stand.
Teddy Lansky produced receipts from a hotel to show her husband had been in Boston at precisely the time Fat Vinny claimed to have been handing money to him in Miami.
So, you know, we were hanging by our threads, right? Because once the witness has lied about one thing in his testimony, you are a gone goose.
It was a very thin case. We'd have been better off leaving Lansky in Israel.
Lansky was acquitted. The little man walked free. For some, it was further evidence of his fiendish brilliance. But for others, doubts were beginning to creep in that Lansky really was as rich and powerful as the government and the press claimed.
Let's put it this way, he lived very modestly. We never caught him spending much money on anything. He had nice suits. It doesn't cost that much to buy a suit. You know? He just lived modestly.
Have a good weekend.
So, mastermind of the mob, or as Lansky himself claimed, a retired investor living on a modest pension. Only in 1983 would the truth be revealed. Lansky died in his bed of cancer. His family gathered for the reading of the will. They too were hoping it would reveal hidden riches. They were disappointed.
I do believe there was a moment of recognition that, boy, this reality is very different than we thought it would be. Because to my knowledge, nobody in that family has a lot of money, and it's not because they secretly do and have hidden it so cleverly. I don't buy it.
I spent a lot of time with his crippled son, Buddy, who, after his death, was living on state charity, something Meyer had always tried to avoid in his lifetime, but he couldn't leave enough money for his beloved crippled son to survive. I think it defies the rules of human behavior that they would go through such denial of comfort for the sake of proving what?
Meyer Lansky never was the all-powerful Godfather some believed. And he lost the bulk of the fortune he had in Havana in 1959. Under constant surveillance by the government, from 1960, he was effectively retired. And he spent most of what he had left on his various legal battles.
How would you describe yourself?
As a human being.
He saw himself as a victim of hypocrisy, even anti-Semitism. But Meyer Lansky never was quite the mastermind the American public believed. He shone only in comparison with other mobsters.
Most of these organized crime guys, they're not educated at all. So we're not operating from a very high plane. So a guy comes along like Lansky, who is quick and good with numbers, and he stands out. He's only bright in connection with the other people around him. He certainly wasn't in Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's league.
You know, the cold hard evidence of Meyer Lansky, the businessman, suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was, or that he thought he was himself.
But the American public is reluctant to abandon the myth.
The great irony is the proof you are a mastermind is that nobody can find any proof. Everybody was running around looking for banks and pawns in this vast game, and they couldn't find them. And then when they couldn't find them, they said, man, this guy's good. there is this belief, especially in America, in the mystical power of the mob. And so when Meyer Lansky would walk his dog, people would go, ah, he's just walking his dog. He's doing the whole walking his dog low-key ruse. No, he was walking his dog.